All right, is anybody who's wants to eat some food and get started? We'll try to make it a little bit interactive. As you know, there was not a class last week because nothing much really happened in the world. So we decided to wait another week and things happened. Who heard of Lin-Manuel Miranda? Maybe you heard of Lin-Manuel Miranda, exactly. Hamilton. Well, he sold the rights to Hamilton to Disney for $75 million, and since then he's been writing shows for kids. I have a kid, so I see his shows. I saw Hamilton too, live and on Disney. Vivo was a big hit. If you haven't seen it, you don't have to be under 7 to enjoy this. And most recently, Encanto. Encanto is a brilliant show about the Madrigal family, each of which has a special gift. And one of the signature songs from the show is "We Don't Talk About Bruno." Bruno is the son, brother, uncle of the main characters in the family, and his special power was revealing the future, and people didn't like the future and created some conflict within the family, and we just don't talk about Bruno. So with my daughter, we paraphrase that to "We don't talk about Putin." So I was asked today, we picked this topic of China, but we should be talking about Russia. I don't know why, but if you didn't see Encanto, spoiler alert, Bruno actually becomes a relevant character. Not only do they talk about Bruno, some people actually embrace Bruno. He's not such a bad guy, but that's where the comparison with Putin stops. We'll talk about both, because a lot really has happened, including the end of the Chinese Olympics, the Olympics that were taking place in China. So 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about the role of China, and when I put together the curriculum for this course back in November, there was some, obviously uncertainty what the world will look like 3-4 months hence. But the order was, we knew unless something calamitous happened that Joe Biden would be marking his first year as President of the United States. We knew that unless, again, some unforeseeable circumstances, China would be hosting the Olympics. We thought, without knowing, and still don't know because we're a week away from next class, that Israel would still be able to preserve this remarkable coalition that we'll talk about next week, and that we will have midterms coming up in November, midterm elections. And the last class, not next week, but the following week, we're really going to focus on the schisms within both parties. Faces and races, some key Senate seats and all the House seats are up for grabs. We'll talk about some of the personalities involved in the process. But I'm going to focus a lot on what's happening within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party, and how the souls of each party is really being contested by the various factions, and it's a two-party system. But it's also going to focus on how the United States looks like to the rest of the world. And if you're in Russia, or you're in China, or if you're in Iran, or if you're in many other countries, you're really looking at leadership, or a lack thereof, within the United States and the rest of the Western world. And when we put in the course content, okay, Joe Biden's 79, he'll be 80 in November. He's celebrating his first year in office. Xi Jinping has now been in office. He'll be commemorating 10 years towards the end of this year, but 5 years ago, he eliminated term limits. So to give you a little bit of Chinese history, we'll come back to Russia in a second, but to give you a little bit of Chinese history, I think that when you follow the players at a level that many people do, we recognize that China is the most populous country in the world. It has been, I think, since recorded history. We talk about the remarkable transformation from a third world backwater rural society that emerged into an economic powerhouse while keeping its political communist system intact. We talk about how the world is dependent on China and how it's manufacturing goods for the entire planet, and how it's rattling its saber in the South China Sea, and threatening its neighbors. and how Xi Jinping is the envy of autocrats everywhere because he's got 1.4 billion people idolizing him and developing a cult personality that even President Trump has said, like, wow, this is pretty cool. How do you do that? I want to look at the man and I want to look at the country because I think it's going to give us a much greater appreciation for things that we don't think about unless we take a deeper dive into these societies. And looking around the room, most of us grew up in the West. Some of us were born in Europe, some of us were born in Israel, it was part of Asia, but still very much with a Western orientation, not only towards culture, values, but most importantly, for the purpose of this discussion, history. And we know what the European borders look like now. We have some appreciation for what they looked like before the Second World War, what they looked like before the First World War. We talk about the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These empires are somewhat accessible to us. For most people, when you hear about the Yuan dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Qin dynasty, the Qing dynasty, there isn't as much differentiation. We may associate the Ming dynasty with vases, we may associate the Qin dynasty with the Silk Road, with paper, but that's not what we learned in grade school unless we took the trouble, like I said, to take a deeper dive. So let's take a brief deep dive today and understand sort of Chinese history. Chinese history is as ancient as any other history of the planet. It's as ancient as Jewish history. And when some of our ancestors, reportedly building the pyramids for the Egyptian pharaohs, which have very little connection to the current Egyptian, population, but like the Greeks and the Romans, they can choose to tie themselves back for 4 millennia, and that's their prerogative. Certainly as much prerogative as we do. We probably don't look very much like the ancient Israelites who moved to Egypt, left Egypt, and were expelled from Judea in 71, during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. The Chinese have looked the same. They've spoken the same language. They've been faithful to their own culture. The printing press, or a form of the printing press, arrived in China 600 years before Gutenberg's printing press in Europe. The first books they published were on Chinese language, a dictionary, an account of their history. They felt very proud. They were warring factions. You had warlords and you had triads, which is sort of Chinese for mafia, organized crime rings. But you did have consolidations. You had periods of real consolidation where China was a preeminent, if not the preeminent superpower in the world at that time. And then about 170, 180 years ago, things changed. Now, Putin is famous for decrying the collapse of the Soviet Union and longing nostalgically for the recreation of the empire, the restoration of Mother Russia as a superpower. And that's one of the reasons people think that he has his sights set on Crimea and now the Donbass region, perhaps the rest of Ukraine, and from there is Belarus and Moldova and who knows what. And we know that there really was a Soviet Union from 1917 till 1991, and for most of our lives it was the other superpower next to the United States of America. But 1991 was not a humiliation. It was a voluntary abdication of an empire and the creation of satellite states, creation of an independent country of Russia. And we talk about, when we do get to Russia later on, because it is important, we talk about how NATO fits into that whole equation. Well, I believe, like I mentioned last class, pushing the Ukraine into NATO might not be the best idea, and certainly now we would have a very different set of choices. If Ukraine was actually part of NATO, 30 member states would have to go in and fight, and we would really have a war with Russia. But Ukraine is not part of Russia, not part of NATO, and therefore the Western powers could behave differently. In China, from 1839 to 1945, you have what was called the century of humiliation. And humiliation could be a dramatic word. Someone called you a name or didn't invite you to their birthday party. You feel humiliated. It wasn't that type of humiliation. This was imperialistic humiliation of the highest order. It started with the First Opium War. Now, when I first heard that as a kid, the Opium War, I thought, okay, the Chinese made opium and they tried to sell it to somebody and people wanted it. And they fought a war over it. It was probably driven by economics. That's not what the first Opium War was about. First Opium War was an initiative by Great Britain. Again, I grew up in Canada, and I remember learning about the American Revolution. And there was a relationship between the American Revolution and what was going on in New France. During the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as it's called here, from 1756 to 1763, Plains of Abraham, Wolfe and Montcalm both die, but basically the British get the French out of North America, leaving the two little islands, St. Clair and Guiana, off the coast of Newfoundland. But that's it. The British drive the French out of North America. It's very expensive. They impose taxes on the colonists here in what's now the United States of America. The colonists say, we should not be paying taxes for your adventures north of us. So they throw tea into the party, give me liberty or give me death. We don't need to go through the American Revolution. But there was a direct connection between the imposition of taxes by the British on the colonists following the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. There was a direct connection in 1792. What the British decided to do was flood the Chinese with opium. Now, we don't have to go that far back into history here to see what happened with Purdue, to see what happened with fentanyl, to see what happened when you have addictions all over the Midwest, and opioid deaths have crept from being negligible to one of the leading causes of death in the United States. It is highly addictive. People do anything for their fixes, and it leaves destruction in the wakes of families, communities, villages. Addiction is a very serious thing. And the British got the Chinese addicted to opium. And the Chinese fought back. And the British basically came in with their stronger navy, and they fought an opium war in the 1840s, and they won. And then, as part of the treaty, you had impositions of, first of all, reparations. You saw the more egregious reparations came later. You saw reparations. You saw ports. In other words, one of the ways the country still today, and then completely had revenue, was imposing tariffs on imports. But here, the Great Britain said, no, we are going to control your ports, and we are going to control your revenues. And there was a slight break in the trade of opium, but if you're addicted, you're addicted. And then surreptitiously initially, and then in droves, more opium came in, and the Chinese fought back. And you had the second opium war, and the Chinese lost that war too. And then Japan invaded China. And this is all, by the way, during the Qing dynasty. It's the last Chinese dynasty from 1644 to 1912. The Qing was the last, depending on any count, between 7 to 10 dynasties in Chinese history. And they were gradually became weaker and weaker and incurred loss after loss. Japan won that war. That was the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Then you had the Boxer Rebellion. These were boxers. They practiced martial arts. They thought that would make them immune to bullets. And they started killing Westerners and missionaries because there was a big threat by the Christian church to overtake Chinese culture and Chinese theology, and they lost that as well. And this is in 1901. The sanctions imposed on China following the Boxer Rebellion were agreed to by 8 countries. I'm going to mention the countries. I think where these countries were 13 and then 38 years later. You had England, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States. Adversaries in 2 successive world wars, that all taking place in the first half of the last century, but here completely agreed that they're going to impose unprecedented financial reparations, $330 million in 1901 dollars, which is tens of billions of dollars today in an economy that had no money and could never repay that. Complete confiscation of their autonomy over their ports. And there was an initiative to just break up the country into these little factions. And Belgium and Spain and the Netherlands all got a few cookies as well. So these are 11 colonial conquerors, if you will, imposing their will on China. And that actually precipitated, 10 years later, in 1911, the fall of the Qing dynasty. Sun Yat-sen, if you follow Chinese history, is remarkable in the sense that he's the only person that I can think of who's regarded as a hero, both by the communists of Kuomintang. He was the founder of the Kuomintang. So when he got rid of when he and his, he do it by himself, obviously he was in exile for most of his life, and then came back, like a lot of people, you know, Ho Chi Minh, I told Khomeini, but then he came back in force, and he was successful in setting in motion events that overturned the Qing dynasty, created the republic, established the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen is a remarkable person. But China then had its own internal, squabbles and power struggles, the creation of the Communist Party, and then Mao Zedong, after a successive series of, power struggles over the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the party, and he was chased to Taiwan in 1949. So when Chiang Kai-shek goes to Taiwan in 1949, it's actually very interesting, because Taiwan, historically, unlike Hong Kong and Macau, wasn't really always part of China. And we'll see how we're going to compare Taiwan to Ukraine in a second, but Taiwan was an independent island. It's much, much smaller. It's less than 1/1000, so 1/10 of 1% of the size of China. And even now, today, that's 23, 24 million people, so less than 2% of the population of China. And, the Portuguese passed it by, called it Formosa. Taiwan was called Formosa. Ilha Formosa, which was a beautiful island in Portugal, Portuguese. And then the Spanish and the Dutch both established trading fortresses in the 1600s and 17th century. For a while, it looked a little bit like modern day Cyprus, where you have the Turks in the north and the Greeks in the south. You had the Dutch in the north and the Spanish in the south. The Dutch got rid of the Spanish, and then when the Qing dynasty defeated the Ming dynasty in 1644. And this is a parallel to 1949, the people who lost from the Ming Dynasty loyalists escaped to Taiwan and got rid of the Dutch, who had gotten rid of the Spanish, and that really was the first time that the Chinese had any real relationship to Taiwan from a sovereignty perspective. So, so if you're watching events going on in the world right now, Jay, you're not allowed to answer this. Anybody here know who Tsai Ing-wen is? Tsai Ing-wen. I'll give you a hint, it's a woman, not a man. She is the president of Taiwan. So if you're glued to your televisions now, looking at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and the reactions of the West, and what's Biden going to say, and what's the EU going to say, and what's the UN going to say, nobody is looking at this more keenly than President Tsai Ing-wen. And when you're Xi Jinping, and you just had your bromance with Putin. Remember, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. We were still in the middle of the Olympics. And they had a statement. China and Russia have had in the modern day a very complicated relationship. They started off as sort of fellow travelers, communists, even Mao Zedong and Stalin had a relationship. And then they had a little bit of a rift in the 1960s. In 1969, they fought a war. People died. Hundreds of people died on the Ussuri River in the northeastern part of China, bordering Russia. A bunch of islands there, Zhendu Island, if you follow your geography. There are lots of little islands that people have been fighting about. But like I said, we know the western borders a lot better, and what countries sort of border Russia to the west. If you look at the eastern border, Russia actually has a small border with North Korea, and a big border with China. So they fought a war, and that actually precipitated Nixon's trip to China, because the Chinese felt that they needed another great power alliance. And the Chinese were intimidated by that war with the Soviet Union in 1969. Both of them had nuclear weapons, and China was relatively new nuclear power, maybe 5 years. The Soviets had had nuclear weapons for 20 years and many, many more. But there really hasn't been a big rapprochement between China and Russia till now they found common cause in trying to stem the advance of the West, and both countries feel empowered to broaden their spheres of influence, which brings us back to Taiwan and Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping grew up as a prince of the Communist Party, right? His father was an ally of Mao Zedong at the very highest levels. He was purged from the party. Being purged from the party it's not, in many cases, it was a death sentence. In Xi Jinping's father's case, it was an expulsion. His son, who was a teenager, was sent to live in a cave in some labor farm. And counterintuitively, his reaction to this experience was not to be just antagonistic towards the party, but to fundamentally believe that fidelity to the party is a critical element of ensuring China's future. And when Mao Zedong passed in 1976, it's called the first generation of modern Chinese leadership, there was a big battle. The Gang of Four, if you remember, sort of took over after his passing, but they were then called out on some of the atrocities that took place during the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. And Deng Xiaoping sort of took control of the party. And when I say took control of the party, there's the one person or two people that we see, but it's the Comintern, it's the whole sort of collective that runs this with one person at the top. And then they decided that they're going to have successive generations of leadership. And the torch passed rather peacefully from the second generation, the third generation, which Jiang Zemin, with Zhu Rongji, and then the fourth generation was Hu Jintao, and then also peaceful transfer, 10-year terms, 1992 to 2002, 2002, 2012, Xi Jinping, and then in 2017, 2018, Xi Jinping decides that 10 years are not enough, and he's going to celebrate its 10th anniversary by looking forward to the 11th and the 12th, and it's not clear how long this is going to last. But his idea of China is not the same as his predecessors. His idea of China is not biding time and making sure that we have a firm economic. I'm not saying that his predecessors' ideas were not in the best interest of China at that time, but he feels that his leadership is taking place at a time when he can assert China's rightful place and restore the historical context that he grew up knowing. And if you think about it, even from the perspective of a little kid, right, it's fundamental fairness. If I want democracy, let's say, we're not talking about actual democracy, because China is not a democracy and doesn't pretend to be a democracy, but, whoever's got the most marbles wins, whoever's got the most, cookies wins, whoever's got the most people. China has the most people. India will surpass them in 5 years. But right now, and for the past uncountable number of centuries, China has had the most people in the world. During that legitimate century of humiliation, they lost 2 wars to Japan. Even after the Boxer Rebellion and even after the creation of the Republic, China was a thankless place, which is what enabled the communists to come and take over. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1937, that was before the commencement of hostilities in Europe, and then that got integrated into the Pacific theater and the broader global conflict. But in every one of its military campaigns, China lost. And China was subject to a series of 18 unequal treaties, they were called, where a dozen different countries imposed, didn't negotiate, imposed conditions on China that completely decimated the country. Xi Jinping knows all of that. And he feels like now it's payback time. And no country, not the United States, not the EU, not Germany, not Japan, not Russia, is in a position to tell China what to do. And up until this current conflict, his focus was economic. And I think, looking at it politically, he had a brilliant initiative. It's called the Belton Road Initiative. He launched this about 4 or 5 years ago. I think we may have talked about it in 2018 when it first came out. Nobody knew what the rollout would look like, but now we know. There have been hundreds of infrastructure projects worth nearly $1 trillion that the Chinese have initiated in countries that are designed to replicate the Silk Road, going all the way to the Caspian, and a maritime road going south all the way into Southeast Asia and also Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Africa, and cultivating intelligently economic relationships in Africa, in Latin America, and doing so with dollars rather than bullets, and confirming two essential components. One is sovereignty, territorial integrity, and which is now a very big test to, if you really try to follow this minute by minute, the biggest test to China right now is how does it deal with the incursion, I'm not calling it an invasion, but incursion of territorial integrity and political independence. China doesn't get involved in other countries' politics. It doesn't. By the way, I think this was a question that came up again in the last class. One of the larger, one of the certainly top 25 recipients of Chinese trade and cooperation as part of the Belton Road Initiative, and also right smack in China's sort of broader sphere of influence is Israel. So the Belton Road Initiative has been a big sort of threat to what America is trying to do. For years, it was, the democracies versus the communists, and you had the Warsaw Pact and then Nato, and the Soviet Union crumbled. China wasn't worth worrying about yet. I mean, in the early 1990s, Deng Xiaoping, as I mentioned earlier, was trying to replicate the Singaporean model that Lee Kuan Yew did with a few million people in a country over 1 billion people, and I think he did a remarkable job. I think when you look back historically on incredible leaders of the world, Deng Xiaoping did have as much power within China as his predecessor, Mao Zedong, or Xi Jinping has today, but that was really the turning point. I mean, he was able to do opening up a country economically and doing it in a very non-threatening way and allowing countries to come in, do business, make money, but still preserve the one-party system is worthy of applause. And the fact that the people in China, for the most part, support this is a function, I think, of two things. One, the power of the party and education and how people's thoughts are influenced. And two, their perception of the West. You see whether it's the January 6th Capitol riots or rioting everywhere, or what's going on in pretty much every Western country. There's no place that if I were a successful person in China, seeing my economic position improve, enjoying political stability, where I'd say, I'd rather be in one of those places. I'd rather be in Minneapolis with the protests. I'd rather be in, LA or other places where they set things on fire. So the elevation of China to the world stage is something that has been cultivated intelligently for decades. And Xi Jinping doesn't see this plateauing, and the momentum is on his side. So when they hosted the Olympics in 2008, it was a very big deal. Now they're hosting it in 2022. The diplomatic boycott, the reason why the West came up with a diplomatic boycott, because it was to try to take away one of his cookies. They didn't want to cancel the Olympics or boycott the Olympics with the athletes, the events themselves. So Putin came, they had their big romance, and as we talked about in the last class, the world's deference to China and Xi Jinping has been criticized. Right? If you're the Uyghurs, if you're among the millions of people in re-education camps, and there's been real genocide, do people compare 2022 with 1936, when the West participated in the Olympics in Munich Berlin, and gave Hitler a platform to showcase the power of Nazi Germany. It was well known that Hitler was an anti-Semite. It was well known that Hitler was a demagogue. It was well known that Hitler was a dictator. But the genocide hadn't started yet. People had not been killed yet. Kristallnacht hadn't even happened, let alone the concentration camps, death camps. In China, that's already happened. And we're supposed to be a little bit smarter and have access to more information and more transparency than in 1936. And there wasn't really much of a peep. I mean, there was maybe, a little blip on the global radar screen of criticism, and those Olympics went ahead. It was clear to most people when Putin went there that during the course of the Olympics he wasn't going to divert attention away from China's party and start a war in Ukraine. I think what we learned from that is that Putin really doesn't like handicapped people, because there is a norm in history that there are no conflicts precipitated during Olympics. It's an unwritten rule and understanding. And the Olympics actually had their closing ceremony in last Friday, on February 18th. But the Paralympics are just getting started now. They don't end until March 13th. So I don't think Putin was paying attention to the Paralympians when he launched his invasion into Ukraine. And I think that this is where I want to tie the two in together. I mentioned in the last class that it's not a balance between Russia and China. China is a much more powerful country today. When you had the Sino-Russian rift in 1969 and the war along the Ussuri River, Russia was a much stronger country. Russia had been a nuclear power for 20 years. China was a newcomer to the small group of nuclear powers. Today it's the reverse. China has a strong, resilient economy. Russia has a very weak economy. Russia's economy is being threatened by some comments that we're hearing in the West. If you have questions about the economic implications are interesting, right? The price of oil is going way up because of the incursion, but Russia is an oil producer, so on that front, at least, Russia is going to benefit from a higher price of oil. The Saudis were asked by President Biden, to increase production in order to put a damper on the price increase, and the Saudis said no. And one of the reasons they said no is we talked about in the last class, that they feel like they've been humiliated by this precedent. And, maybe in the next class or the last class we'll talk a little bit more about the Abraham Accords, but I think that Saudi Arabia has a much more important role to play than it's being allowed to play because of inferior communication between our current government and the Saudis. And the Saudis are no angels, right? But they're very important players and critical players when it comes to energy prices. And I think that in the last class we talked about the midterms. I think how people feel economically, especially, but not only about inflation, will be a very important factor when we have our midterm elections in November. So, deterrence military deterrence has been, for the mathematicians in the room, described as a product of capability times willingness, right? How capable you are multiplied by your willingness to deploy those capabilities, such as they may be. So coming back to my daughter again, she knows that any number times zero, even infinian, as she calls it, is zero. So you can have infinite capabilities, which we don't, but we have talking about sort of as a spokesperson for the West, we have considerable capabilities, but a declared willingness of zero to use them when it comes to military capabilities. Without saying anything pro-Trump or anti-Trump, when he was asked many times about what he thinks regarding a potential conflict looming on the horizon, his response almost always was, we'll see. We'll see what happens. So sometimes you want a leader to say, we'll see what happens. I mean, you don't show your cards. You don't tell somebody what you're willing to do and not willing to do. And our current president, maybe this was strategic. There were certainly some things that were done in the past few weeks that were thought out pretty well, but said we are not going to send troops to Ukraine. We're going to hit them hard. There'll be sanctions, crippling sanctions. We're coordinated, but you can't sleepwalk through a conflict like this. And now the question is, what happens next? For those of you who follow banking transactions, Russia could get kicked out of SWIFT, meaning that they won't have access to the international banking system. The oligarchs are an extremely powerful component of Putin's cadre of not so much advisors, but cronies. And it's a very, this is what we call crony capitalism. It's crony kleptocracy, because they essentially stole the country's resources away from the people in the 1990s. But these are many mega billionaires who could be hit hard. What does that mean? That means that the economy of central London will be impaired. That means that home prices in Sunny Isles will go down. It means that all sorts of terrible things may happen. But I don't know if the West has the temerity to get Russia out of the SWIFT system. But I think hitting the oligarchs hard would send a very strong message. I don't know if Putin is the richest person in the world, but if he isn't, he's not far from it. He's certainly taken care to line his own pockets over the past 22 years that he's been in power. But he's learned lessons. So let's talk about Putin. Let's talk about Putin. He, what we know is he started his career as a KGB intelligence operative. He was sent to East Germany. He saw the crumbling of the wall. He saw the dismantling of the Soviet Union, and he wept. He wept for Mother Russia. And it's always sat ill with him that the great superpower was reduced to just another country. And then he was Yeltsin's national security advisor before becoming prime minister and then becoming president. And as national security advisor in 1998 or 99, Kosovo, when we had the conflict in Kosovo, for those of you who remember that, it didn't seem like such a big deal at the time, but the Russians didn't like it. The Russians were not happy about Kosovo being regarded as another, now that was a NATO operation. If you look at things that NATO actually did do, NATO and General Wesley Clark at the time essentially created a new country out of former Yugoslavia, and they called it Kosovo. It wasn't one of the Yugoslav provinces. It was considered certainly by the Serbs as part of Serbia, and now it's a new country. And Putin decided, as national security advisor, that when NATO clears Kosovo, Russia's going to take its fair share. It's going to take its fair share of troops. So he called up Hungary, he called up Romania, he called up Ukraine and said, we need to fly, bring in crack commando paratroopers. We need to fly over your airspace, and he didn't get permission. He didn't get permission to fly over the airspace because they kind of probably knew what he was up to. And I think that Putin doesn't like those memories. Putin doesn't want to live in a world where he needs Ukrainian permission to get from where he is to where he wants to be. And he doesn't like the fact that NATO is encroaching upon his doorstep. I personally think that aggressive NATO expansion following the collapse of the Soviet Union was an historic mistake. I think it's reversible, but now it's sort of a game of chess. I don't completely understand, unless he really wants to replicate the Soviet Union, why Putin thinks that it's in his interest to have some of these, fractured little less than states as part of his sphere of influence. Yes, he got Crimea. Crimea historically was always part of Russia, by the way. Most of you know that. Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, gave Crimea to the Ukrainians as a gift, and Putin took it back in 2014. Ironically, also, just weeks after the 2014 Winter Olympics that were then held in Sochi. So next time there are any Winter Olympics, watch what happens. But, whether it's Slovakia or South Ossetia or Georgia, I mean, he's trying to get these little satellites, and I don't know what message he's sending. What message he's sending is that, to countries that are flirting with democracy or having challenges to their democracy, that this certainly doesn't seem like a better formula. So I have no way of knowing what his game plan there is, but it is very interesting for me to watch how China reacts. Because remember, for old Star Trek fans, the prime directive was non-interference. The prime directive, Kirk and Spock and McCoy and Scotty will land on a planet, but the prime directive is non-interference. No matter how bad or odious or nefarious their activities may seem, you do not interfere with local culture or historical events. So China says that non-interference in territorial integrity and sovereignty. Sovereignty is the key word that the Chinese use, the protection of sovereignty. the beginning of this year, in January, Zelensky and Xi Jinping celebrated 30 years of Ukrainian and Chinese commercial cooperation. That's $30 million of trade with one another. It's smaller than with Russia, but it's a significant country. Ukraine is not an insignificant country. Anybody want to guess how many people live in Ukraine?
40 million?
Yeah, 45 million people. That's like, I don't know, I mean, for those of you in the room, 10-15% more than Canada. So that's a significant country. And there is a, I think, challenge to China right now on how to react. Because I don't know what Xi Jinping expected. I don't know what Putin told him. I certainly think that Putin was emboldened by the joint communique that was issued at their meeting, where our relationship knows no limits. That's an unprecedented expression of friendship, but without content, right? You can't test no limits until you start doing things that raise questions about where the limitations might realistically be. But China is certainly watching the West carefully. Iran is watching the West carefully. What happens now in Ukraine will be a bellwether, canary in the coal mine, if you will, you know that expression, of how far the Chinese can go. It's a different war, obviously. You know, Chinese pretensions over Taiwan would be, you know, sort of missiles, obviously, but the destruction of the Taiwanese maybe, and then, you know, followed by a ground occupation or an invasion. And I don't know at what point China, if ever, considered that. It didn't need to do that in Hong Kong. It was negotiated with the Brits to get it back in 97. Macau with the Portuguese in 99. But Taiwan's a very different story. And I think that the Iranians are looking at the response of the West right now. And a lot of things are happening, right? We're trying to renegotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. The Iranians are spinning centrifuges, accelerating their nuclear program. They're now about to get billions of dollars in sanctions relief. We all know what they're going to be doing with that money. It's not going to be for social programs in Tehran. So this is probably one of the more interesting periods of history that I can recall where there's so many moving pieces on the board at the same time. And you know, if I go back to my 4-year-old, one of the many cute things that I recall is you know, coming from a restaurant with these fortune cookies, and I open up a fortune cookie, and you know, one time she opened it up, and I said, "Do you want me to read your fortune?" She goes, "I know what it says." I go, "Really? What does it say?" "Don't eat the paper." I didn't actually say that, but I wonder whether from Xi Jinping's you know, worldview, in a few years from now, when we open up our fortune cookies, it'll say, "Time to learn Mandarin." Because we're not telling you what your fortune is, but it's very closely tied in with ours. China definitely plans to keep this train moving forward. The Belton Road Initiative has an end date of 2049 to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Communist Party. That is still 27 years from now. Xi Jinping was born in 1953, so he'll be celebrating his 96th birthday in 2049. You know, not a kid, but Deng Xiaoping died in 97, so you can still do it. Putting that cynicism aside, he has a very, very long-term vision of where he sees China's role in the world. He's not going to do, I don't think, very much in this conflict with Ukraine to see himself in bed with either Russia or the West. I think that he's going to look at it like he looks at most things from a very selfish perspective on how this serves his interests, how the West reacts. And if you were Taiwan or other sort of Western allies in close proximity to China, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, you're definitely watching this very closely. So even though, had I known in November what would be happening in the middle of February, I might have sort of focused more on Russia than on China. China is not just very much a big player in what's going on in this current conflict, but China, given its tentacles in so many different countries of the world, economically, will be a factor in more things, probably than any other single country, including the United States of America. China has diplomatic relations with 179 out of 193 countries, and Taiwan has been recognized by 13 countries in the Vatican, and China knows that. So for China, it's just a matter of time before it takes back Taiwan. So we'll be looking for a catalyst. For China, it's just a matter of time before the erosion of Western concern about the Pacific will allow it to reclaim, not establish, reclaim its sphere of influence in and around the South China Sea, which includes Korea, both Koreas, which includes Japan, which includes the Philippines, and then ultimately Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand. So the Chinese ambitions, not territorial ambitions. I think they just wanted to store. There were always some border clashes with India. Still a very modest dispute that I think people have forgotten about with Russia. But Taiwan's really the only big one in that. I don't think China wants to conquer any of these other countries, but I think that China wants to reassert itself as a global power, and certainly within its part of the world, similar to the Monroe Doctrine, 1925. To the Europeans, get your hands off the Americas. I think what Xi Jinping is essentially saying, approximately exactly 200 years later. This is our playground, this is our backyard. You're welcome to come, you're welcome to visit, but you're not welcome to stay. So, Shabbat Shalom, I'll take questions.
Yes.
Could you describe the relationship between Putin and Israel?
So you want the question?
I'll repeat the question.
Can I describe the relationship between Putin and Israel? Sure. It's a relationship of interests. It's a relationship of respect. I think Putin has a lot of respect for Israel. But it's a dynamic relationship. So one of the things that we've covered, not just in the last class, but in the past few years, is that once the United States created a vacuum in Syria, the Russians filled that very quickly. Now, both Russia and Israel have interests in Syria. Israel has a more existential interest in Syria, but Israel can only fly its sorties with, I'll say the acquiescence, but the acknowledgement of the Russians, who, for the most part, control Syrian airspace. And there was a glitch. There was a glitch when a Syrian anti-aircraft missile hit a Russian plane because the Israeli plane that was the target of the missile succeeded in certain evasive maneuvers, and Israel was criticized for sort of being there without Russian approval. Israel was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, because I mentioned in the last class, this conflict is certainly not in Israel's interest any way you look at it. Israel does not want tension between two countries that it has friendly relationships with. So when it I think was kind of forced to make a statement about Ukraine, it took about 11 minutes for the Russians in the UN to contest Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. So it's a relationship of respect. I don't think it's going to be jeopardized by Israel sort of being critical of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But Israel, I think, would like to say and do as little as possible while understanding that it has to choose sides. Israel's still very much in bed with the West.
Actually, three questions. First of all, you can talk about the Jews' influence in China from Silicon Valley to after the Second World War. Number two is, do you think that NATO will come in point with some other country come and rescue, come and send troops to fight Russia. I mean, our history shows that most of the NATOs, when we were in Afghanistan, there's a few countries sent some troops to help us, such as the UK and Canada, but most of them stayed away. And there's a split even now between Germany and Italy. They really don't want any stronger sanctions. So I don't think. And number two is, I think what's happening also, and also I would like to comment is, there's three countries that are going to dominate the world. And one is China. Iran is going to dominate, wants to dominate the Middle East. And Russia is going to want to dominate. That's why he wants to sort of give it to Quebec and to the way Boston, Russia.
Okay, I'll repeat the questions. First question is, I did comment on the Jewish influence in China from the Silk Road, which was 125 CE, so 1900 years ago, to modern day China. Look, frankly, Jews have not been very good. There have been Jews in China, and some people think that maybe one or more than 10 lost tribes migrated there. There was famously a Jewish population in Shanghai that were there as refugees during the Second World War. That was actually controlled by Japan. Japan controlled Manchuria, and it was the same fate for Jews. There are a lot of Jews running around China now, Israeli Jews and Jewish businessmen from other countries. But you know, that's, as much as I like to relate things to Israel and the Jewish people, it's not a good. There's a lot of respect in China for Israel and for Jewish people in general. Your second question has to do with NATO. You asked me a question, will NATO come to the defense of Poland if Poland is invaded, where it didn't really participate actively in Afghanistan except for a few countries like Canada and the United Kingdom. Very big difference. NATO doesn't require all NATO members to participate in military campaigns. But NATO is a defense treaty, which means that if a NATO member is invaded, the other NATO members have to come to its defense. Afghanistan is not a NATO member, so if one of the NATO or a few of the NATO members decide that they want to pursue an adventure outside of NATO, it's voluntary participation. If a NATO country is invaded, and that would certainly be a test if Poland were invaded, by treaty, the other 29 members of NATO would have to come to Poland's defense. I don't think Poland will be invaded. So I don't think that gets tested. But if it does get tested, it'll be interesting. I think that, yeah, I think at that point, certainly if it's the 7th or 8th or 9th domino to fall after everything that seems to be starting right now. By the way, my personal thoughts are, I think it's more likely than not that this is relatively limited. I think that Putin knows something, and he knows a lot of things. It's that it's a lot easier to go into a country than to keep control over it. Crimea is easy because it's mostly Russian speaking. The Donbass region is also easy, but he didn't declare them to be part of Russia. He acknowledged the independence of the two Russian enclaves within the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, but he didn't now sort of put the white, blue and red, white and blue on that territory. Your last question about the three countries wanting to control the world, well, you left out the United States, but certainly China, Iran, and Russia would love to expand their spheres of influence. All the kids on my dorm floor in law school want to be president of the United States one day. So, sure they want to do stuff. I don't think that, I think we covered China and what it wants. I don't think China wants that everybody should really speak Chinese. That fortune cookie anecdote was a joke. But Russia doesn't want NATO on its doorstep. Russia doesn't understand, like a lot of people don't understand, including George Kennan and Tom Friedman and other people who are following this closely, don't understand why NATO expanded after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact disintegrated. There wasn't really a reason to punch Russia in the nose when it was trying to maintain some level of dignity after voluntarily abdicating empire. Remember, not a bullet was fired in connection with the dismemberment of the Soviet Union. So coming to Iran, I mean, Iran is the subject of a whole course, or certainly a lecture or two. But we talked about going through the dynasties in China. Russia has its own history, but if you're Iranian and you think about the Persian Empire, and you think about the glory days of Iranian influence all across that part of the world, I think it's the most malicious. The reason why I excluded it from this particular curriculum is not because it's no less important, it's a piece is important, but it seems to get a lot of airtime. I find like in my readings of what's going on in the Jewish world, the Israeli world, Iran is everywhere. Same as the Abraham Accords. I could have dedicated an entire lecture to the Abraham Accords. Iran is an extremely serious threat. But I don't think that Iran is a potential catalyst for another global conflict. Iran has no real friends. I mean, no real friends that matter in terms of Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, the Houthis in Yemen. But there isn't any relationship that Iran enjoys with a serious country. Look, Russia and China had joint military exercises over the past year, one of which the Iranians also participated in. So, yes, there are those relationships, but Iran is not Russia's not at that level. I mean, I think if I didn't make anything clear last class for this class, Russia and Iran are not at the level of China and the United States. Those really are the two global superpowers. Russia and Iran are pretenders. Obviously, they don't like to be called that. They don't want to see themselves that way, but they're not. To the extent that Iran has any pretensions of global hegemony, it's going to have to do it, it's not going to succeed, but it's going to try to peck its way there through violence, terrorism, financial mischief. So Iran is a very, very bad actor. I think everything that we can do in our power to keep it in check is legitimate. It's funny. Jimmy Carter came out with a statement yesterday. That peace should be restored. 96 years old. It's no 1924. She's 97 years old. I mean, I think Putin was lucky that Carter didn't threaten him to do to him what he did to Ayatollah Khomeini after he took hostages. Iran is and has been a very bad actor for 43 years, and I hope that it isn't given the resources to just do more harm. It's going to do harm. There's no way that we're going to live for the foreseeable future without an Iran that is going to be a real menace to a world we'd rather live in. So I think anything you do to stop them is legitimate. Yes?
Question. We're going 20 years ahead of time now when China's the #1 superpower in the world. With the pandemic that that is going on still now, do you feel that the reparations will be asked from China to pay for this?
The question is, given the, do I think that we'll be able to get reparations from China to pay for the economic consequences of the pandemic? So, I mean, the answer was,
when they're #1. 20 years from now, when they're #1.
Well, they're #1, then we have less leverage, right? I mean, the countries cannot impose, any economic reparations from the Chinese after the Boxer Rebellion, except for the fact that they held all the cards. So if China's #1, we're holding fewer cards than we are right now. And right now, we have more cards. And by the way, I don't think China is going to be the global superpower. I think China has a lot of real systemic challenges. I think China is going to suffer even more from the one-child policy that it instituted. Now then it went to 2, now it's 3. But China's got some demographic challenges, some institutional challenges, some corruption challenges. China's not an easy case. I mean, if I painted a picture that China's got an unobstructed path towards global hegemony, that's not the impression I was hoping to leave. 20 years from now, I still think you're going to have a powerful United States. If you come to the last class in 2 weeks from now, then I'll talk about where I think the real threats to the United States are and where maybe the Chinas of the world will be more powerful because they don't have to grapple, at least on the surface, with those kinds of internecine conflicts that are plaguing the United States. But no, I don't think we'll ever get reparations from China for the pandemic. And I think that the pandemic, as decimating as it was, if you look at it from an economic perspective, sure, some restaurants were closed and cruise ships had to, renegotiate debt service agreements with their lenders, and some sectors of the economy were hit hard, and some just flourished. So I don't know how you even calculate the cost of the pandemic. If you look at it in global market capitalization, it's higher than it was pre-pandemic. Millions of people died, but tens of millions of people die every year in the world. Actually, probably over 100 million people die every year in the world. So yes, there was an increase in a few percentage points in the number of global deaths, but I don't know. Even if there was a clear way, I'm not saying there isn't, but even if there was a clear way to demonstrate that this was an intentionally fabricated virus in a Wuhan laboratory that was then set loose upon the world. I'm not saying I think that. I actually don't think that. How do you claim it? You need to have a real constellation of actors that can impose and enforce the collection of reparations. We don't have that. It's there.
How do you view, how should one view Trump's recent comments complimenting Mr. Putin?
How should we regard Trump's recent comments regarding Mr. Putin? I think we should regard him the way we regard all of President Trump's comments.
I'm not on board with China wanting to become the superpower that a lot of people think that it wants to become. In Chinese, the word for China is zhongguo. Zhong means middle. And a lot of people think it's right. They go on the philosophy that they want to be in the middle, that they're not trying to take over the world. Pertaining to Taiwan, as you know, I live in Taiwan, is that they feel as if there was a matter of law, it's their property, and they're here to take it back. The only other thing I would mention is you mentioned about Minneapolis as an example of people don't want to flee China to go to other places. There is a group of people in China that just don't want to get out because the authority that the government has. When I first lived in China, a policeman could incarcerate you for 3 years before even pressing charges. There's a law right in the re-education facility. So people live in that fear, like they could be pretending to be tough and use money to get around, but they recognize that a police officer or the government, whoever has watching their power above you, can squash you. And I think there's a lot of return Chinese that are on board with that theory as well, like we don't have to tolerate this forever.
Yeah, good point. So as far as the Middle Kingdom is concerned, yes, I hope I made that point. That China really doesn't have intentions of conquering other countries, but it certainly wants to, expand its sphere of influence, right? Even as the Middle Kingdom, the Northern Kingdom, the Southern Kingdom wasn't shy about wanting to, be well loved by its neighbors. As far as internal dissent and expats coming back and expressing political disaffection, I think you're absolutely right. In a country with 1.4 billion people, you're going to find pockets of dissent that number in the tens of millions, right? I mean, tens of millions are rounding errors when you're counting Chinese. But China's been pretty good about tamping that down with force, and nothing sharpens the mind like the guillotine, right? You've heard that expression. So look at Jack Ma. Jack Ma is a great example of somebody who left, lived in the United States. He learned about the internet, he learned about commerce, he came back to China, and he built an empire, built a huge empire, Alibaba, which had the largest IPO in history. And the subsidiary company called Ant Finance, which provided the micro-lending to Alibaba. Alibaba and Tencent controlled the entire Chinese internet economy. If you wanted to have a successful company, you ought to be in bed with Alibaba or Tencent. And then Jack Ma, right before the Ant-IPO, which was going to be valued at $35 billion, decides that he's going to compare Chinese banks to a pawn shop. And he's a very colorful guy. Like when he had his corporate parties, he'd get up with his Elvis costume or other costume, play the guitar. Sort of reminds you of a bunch of drunk Japanese businessmen singing karaoke, but he's worth $50 billion, so people clap. Except if you're a banking regulator. If you're a banking regulator and you're watching Jack Ma in a room criticize you and calling your bank a pawn shop, you shut down his IPO, and they did. And you put him in place. It's not in a re-education account, but we talked about holding the cards, which is why I think coming back to Russia, the oligarchs have sort of skimmed over a little bit, but there are a lot of sort of Jack Ma-like characters. Jack Ma, by the way, benefited tremendously from all sorts of advantages that he got from the Chinese government. They bought into his narrative, which was a true narrative, that what he was doing was going to create a lot more jobs in China. He benefited from a massive reduced amount of regulation, so it ended. Chinese banks were required to hold many more resources against loans that they were making, something Ant can do with 2%. On the microloans that Ant was making, they had to have 2% in reserves against those loans. And then they said, you know what, before your IPO, this is now going to go into a prospectus. We don't want the world to see, so we're going to raise you from 2 to 10. And he called the pawn shops. And never went public. And that $35 billion IPO never happened. So yes, you're right, there are going to be pockets of dissent. And look, anytime you have an autocratic, dictatorial, communist system with very little personal freedom, cameras everywhere that know where you're going, what you're saying, what you're thinking, you're going to have people who don't like it. So the good news for Chinese is that the borders are open. In other words, not like the old Soviet Union where we couldn't leave. Someone from China wants to go as long as they can get a visa to another country. The Chinese government is not forcing people to stay. Yes?
Two quick remarks. First of all, it's not completely true. The statement that Crimea was always the Russian part was for quite a few centuries part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1857, UK and Great Britain and France fought a war against Russia to avoid Russia to divide the Crimean area.
I think it's called the Crimean War.
Exactly. Second point, the situation in Taiwan and also, the relation with China was not so strong because basically Taiwanese people hate the Chinese people. All the 19th century, Taiwan was under the Japanese ruling, and the Taiwanese people were very happy with the Japanese, until in 1947 arrived the Chinese with Chiang Kai-shek, and the whole situation changed. Okay, close the parenthesis. My question is this: in this situation, what are the options for Israel to supply from the Leviathan gas to Europe?
Okay. So let me try to capture that. So you're saying Crimea was not historically always part of Russia. For those of you who sort of know your geography a little bit, Crimea looks like this, little kidney-shaped isthmus that juts into the Black Sea. And yes, there was a war. The Crimean War was fought among several European powers. What I'm saying is Crimea was not historically part of Ukraine. That was the point I was trying to make. Not that Crimea was historically part of Russia so much, but it was part of Russia when Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, at the head of the Soviet Union, decided to reallocate Crimea to it was an executive decision made in the 1950s. Regarding Taiwan, I think I tried to make that point, that Taiwan doesn't historically, there was no real affiliation between all of the Chinese kingdoms in Taiwan until the refugees from the Ming Dynasty took Taiwan from the Dutch in 1666. You're right about the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 did control Taiwan through the end of the Second World War. It wasn't when Chiang Kai-shek came into 1949. It was already back to China since 1945. After the Japanese surrendered, they did surrender Taiwan back to China. As far as Israel's role with Leviathan, if that was your question, Leviathan is a gigantic natural gas field. And I guess the question is, to the extent that the ability or the willingness of the Western European countries to accept Russian oil and that Russian natural gas is curtailed, and if Olaf Scholz, the new Chancellor of Germany, bravely, even before the actual incursion into Ukraine, was going to cut Nord Stream 2, which is the massive natural gas pipeline. Can Israel make up for the difference? To an extent, Logistically, it doesn't extend that far. You get as far as Greece, and then you can ship it. But once you get into the liquefaction of natural gas, which you would have to do, and then have regasification facilities constructed, to the best of my knowledge, as it's currently configured, Israel is not an obvious source of supply for whatever Russia would not be able to provide. But if Russia was perpetually pariah and nobody would, and Nord Stream 2 is forever shut down. Yeah, I mean, the good news is there are enough natural gas resources in the Mediterranean, maybe then Lebanon and Israel get their act together, because there's considerable, and then Turkey that's now kind of looking to, mention that in the last class, I don't know if you were here, but making some friendly overtures. So yeah, there's a path to alternative supply routes coming from the Eastern Mediterranean to Western Europe in the event that Russian resources are cut off. But from a logistical standpoint, from a transportation standpoint, Russia is a much more obvious supplier. But that's why I don't think this is going to last as long as some people fear. Yes?
I just wanted to make some comments. I recently read the book, The Last Kings of Shanghai, and if people are interested about the life of Jews in China, that's really very interesting.
Good.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I-
It's a business rivalry between the Sassoons and another, it's a difficult name, I don't remember the name of the second family. And it's very interesting how they rule the economy of
Oh.
China.
Okay, we have a book recommendation, The Last Kings of Shanghai, and it talks about the Sassoon family that from I think they were Iraqi Jews. I think they were Iraqi
And
Jews.
the Kadori Jews, right?
So, yes, we'll take these two and one back, yeah.
What do you think, will the dollar be the reserve currency of the world? I know that China wants to replace the American dollar.
I don't think the status of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency is under threat. I think if anything, events like those taking place this week make it more likely that the United States dollar remains the global reserve currency. Wendy?
As a very scared grandmother, I don't understand why, after Putin said he was going to come into these countries, why didn't these people pick up their kids and get out when they had time? And now it's panic, panic, panic.
Look, if you believe the press reports, 137 soldiers died. That's a lot of people, right? I mean, if you see those commercials about how many traffic deaths are acceptable, 50, well, that's my family, that's my friends. In the context of a geopolitical conflict, it's not yet a call for streaming refugees. To your point, the countries around Ukraine, including Romania, and Bulgaria, and Slovakia, and Slovenia, have all announced that they're prepared to take in Ukrainian refugees. Hungary also. But I don't know whether or not. Certainly, there's no fear of annihilation. This isn't like the Nazis coming into Lithuania or Slovakia. There is a fear of collateral damage, right? I mean, I don't think that Russia cares about civilian casualties as much as some other countries, certainly Israel does. But I don't think, statistically speaking, the risk of dying in this military campaign, in a country of 45 million people, if you see 10, 20,000 civilian deaths, it's a huge number, right? I mean, we talked about Sunny Isles, Sunny Isles is about 20,000 people. So, I mean, everybody Sunny Isles, I live there, will want that to happen, but in a country of 45 million people, if you do the math, I mean, to have a massive exodus of an entire country just would be the wrong thing. I can't speak, I'm not a grandparent, I'm a parent, I'm living in Ukraine now.
Pick up your kids and get out.
Well, where do you go? Then you
Anywhere out home.
and then you come back. Okay, maybe. I mean, some people can do
Come back
that.
when it's safe.
So the good news for you is a lot of people do it. So, and better news is that unlike, again, coming back to Jews in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, they have places to go. You don't have this massive exodus yet where people are just trying to get into a neighboring country that are being told you can't get in. You already know that, right?
Yeah, you said that Russia and Israel sort of have a peaceful coexistence, but I read that there's 200,000 Jews now in Ukraine. Israel is not going to do anything for those Jews. I don't know.
Well, whatever the number is, I mean, it used to be well over 200,000, but I mean,
40,000.
I just read
40,000.
Yeah.
whatever the, you know what, split the difference. There are 120,000 Jews. And who's a Jew? You know, here's the difference, right? So you're wearing a yarmulke, right? So according to our friend Richard, you need to, unless your mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother Jewish, you're not really Jewish. So there are 40,000 of us. In your case, you feel Jewish, you like matzo ball soup, you have 200,000. Whatever the number is, okay, whatever the number is. I don't know what the expectation is, right? It's not, Israel has not closed its border to any Jew, ever. So even if the number were 200,000, unless there was some issue here and somebody said, you know, yeah, I watched Fiddler on the Roof, you can let me in. But if you're legitimately Jewish, you have a right to return to the state. As far as aid, yeah, everybody's planning on it. All the Chabads are planning aid, the Israeli government is planning aid. I mean, there are all sorts of, you know, emergency preparation programs going on, but this isn't the Jewish crisis. It could become one, obviously. I mean, you know, can't predict these things. But as we're sitting here, okay, standing, speaking right now, it's not a Jewish crisis. It's not a
Yet the federations and everybody's asking to help the Jews in Ukraine.
right. Well, that's their business. Yes.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot. I hope I remember some of it. But I have a very trivial question. How long, now I understand how important it is. How long does it take to learn Mandarin?
How long does it take? The question is, how long does it take? How long does it take to learn Mandarin? Well, I guess it depends how long you, how much you remember from this lecture.
When they come, that means they should be ready. So how long?
It's very prevalent in the West Coast.
Yes, I know. It's very prevalent on the West Coast. It's very prevalent among Russians. I live in the Sunny Isles. My daughter played for kids who speak Russian, and the parents are just lamenting the fact that they can't get into the Mandarin class. But I'm not kidding. But that's, you know, I mean, some of them are extremely efficient. They're learning to play the piano in them. Yeah.
You mentioned we're going to touch on digital currency.
Oh, right, I did say that. So, you know, she asked me about whether the dollar is going to be the reserve currency. Right, it's a lot to cover. But I do owe you an answer to that question. So digital currency, Bitcoin, which is a talk in and of itself, is increasingly used by bad actors in the world. And counterintuitively, the Chinese have been very much against Bitcoin. In other words, Bitcoin is not encouraged in China. The Chinese are not allowed to invest in Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has been shut out of China. And now one of the big questions for people who follow the trading, volatility, pricing of Bitcoin is, does China become more like the rest of the world? The Chinese people, I don't want to say something that would sound, you know, get me in trouble or some stating this, but you know, there's a reason why the casinos in Macau are so successful. There is a little bit of a you know, gambling history in the culture. Would be all over Bitcoin. I mean, if Bitcoin were just opened up in China, it would create an enormous amount of demand. Or does the rest of the world become more like China and regulate Bitcoin more? So if the question is China specific, that's my answer. If the question is how precisely Bitcoin is being used by terrorists, money launderers, arms dealers in global commerce, I'll make sure that's a lecture next year's class. Yes.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about, okay, let's say Putin goes and Zelensky's, what is he going to do to him? The whole world is watching. What is he going to do? He wants to decapitate him.
I don't think he wants to decapitate. He's not going to decapitate.
How could he do that?
He's not going to decapitate.
Yeah, but look at the guy he's been poisoning. So what is he going to do to Zelensky and his family? What's going to
So
happen?
Zelensky was on TV, yes, they said, I'm target number one, and my family's
He's
target
already,
number two.
he's already going to be convicted of war crimes. How much further can he go? The whole world is watching.
I think that, Putin also said today that he wants to negotiate with, with Ukraine. And I think what he'd like to do, I don't know Putin's endgame is, but I don't think he wants to stay in Ukraine. I think what he'd like to do is establish a more Russian-friendly government in Ukraine. Give Zelensky and his family a nice exit package. Maybe give him his own TV show in Moscow. But what he wants more than anything else, and again, I haven't talked about this recently, but I think what he wants more than anything is to send a message to the Western world: stop with this NATO nonsense. Just stop it. Stop with this NATO nonsense. You want to stop with this constitutionalizing your God-given right to join NATO in Kiev, and stop with this expansion from Brussels, and this is an anachronistic Cold War, anti-Soviet treaty organization that has no place in the modern Western world, and certainly has no place on Russia's current borders. That's what I think he wants. Anybody else, before I go back for seconds, I'll take these last two questions. Well, hold on, you didn't ask a question.
Russia's maybe contemplating cyber warfare against some of the NATO countries, the United States or whatever. How would they react to that?
Right, so that's a big point. So Russia is certainly not contemplating cyber. Russia is constantly engaging in cyber warfare with the Western world, and we're constantly engaging in cyber warfare with Russia. I mean, cyber warfare is offense and defense, and so far it's been relatively carefully calibrated. Once that gets out of control, all bets are off, and it could be catastrophic, including the water you drink, the cars you drive, the planes you fly on. So Russia knows that for every reaction, sort of like Newton's law on steroids, for every reaction there's an unequal and greater disproportionate reaction. I'll take, do you have another question?
No, I was going to make a comment about NATO. The German army has now down to 60,000 troops. So one time I was saying with 500 or half a million under arms, like the second most important, the third most important power in NATO.
Yeah, NATO's not essentially the United States. But I agree that all European countries have reduced NATO.
My question has to do with NATO likewise. Is NATO a threat because of its democratic position or its militaristic position to Russia?
Both. And it's also, more importantly, it's a symbolic threat. It's a symbolic threat. It's a message: good guys and bad guys. You're going to be the good guys or the bad guys. Russia's the bad guys, we're the good guys. Let's have more good guys. You want to play on my team? Remember, it's like, what's your favorite sport?
My favorite?
Yeah.
It depends on the season.
Well,
Right now it's basketball.
Okay, what's your favorite team?
Warriors. My favorite team?
Yeah.
It's tough.
Say Golden State Warriors.
No, it's Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Right, it's Philadelphia 76ers. Great team. They win some games, they lose some games. If they're the only team in the league, suddenly sport doesn't become interesting, right? So if you're going to watch something, you want to have an opponent who's going to win. It's not just dribbling practice. So NATO exists as a counterweight to something else. NATO was established as a counterweight to the old Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries.
Wasn't NATO supposed to be established so we don't have a World War III?
Yes, but then once the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disintegrated, Russia wanted to be part of the process that would prevent a World War III against some then unknown adversary. Instead, Russia, in its dismembered form, was preserved as an adversary, so NATO could not only continue to exist, but expand, and not only expand, but expand specifically by integrating those countries that were previously part of the Warsaw Pact, that had no stronger connection to democracy than Russia did. So that's why the George Kennans of the world, who know a little bit about the Soviet Union, just couldn't understand what the West was doing when it expanded NATO in the 1990s. Yes, last question, Richard.
Okay, I know it's the best of it, but I'm asking 4 questions.
By the way, just so you know, that's 7. Okay, we got 3 in the first one.
Do you think that American companies contribute to the growth of the Chinese economy? Of course, it came to China because it's a large population, they make a lot of money. But on the other hand, they contribute to technology and other aspects of the economy.
Do I think that the global companies are doing what for China?
Contribute to the growth of the Chinese
Yeah, of course, but their shareholders benefit. So global companies have been very active in China because it's the largest market in the world.
Yeah.
And you know, at some point, this statement too big to fail. So the role of China in the global economy is too big to fail, and that's why this is very different than any other sort of interaction between two global superpowers in history. So hopefully I'll see you all before Passover.